Jamie Iceman Stevenson, the drug kingpin, has been jailed for 20 years over a global plot to flood Scotland with £100 million worth of cocaine.
We know that he operates at the top table of organised criminality.
It's all about ego, it's all about power, it's all about violence and threats.
He is perhaps the most prolific drug dealer in Scotland in recent years.
Jamie the Iceman Stevenson, the drug kingpin, has pleaded guilty on the fourth day of this trial to planning to flood Scotland with deadly drugs.
Not just a dealer in the sense of distribution within Scotland, but his criminal enterprise is truly international and it spans countries, continents and decades. He has been responsible for bringing in untold quantities of drugs, which in turn have killed record numbers of people in our country.
It's all about ego, it's all about power, it's all about violence and threats.
We know that he operates at the top table of organised criminality, but what I think this investigation demonstrated was just the extent of those international contacts and networks that he was operating with.
Jamie Stevenson grew up in North Glasgow and developed a reputation as a swaggering teenage street thug. He grew up in the Red Road flats in Barmulloch at a time when there was a heroin epidemic looming on the horizon of Scotland. So by the time the early 1980s arrived, Stevenson's reputation was becoming known throughout the underworld in the north of Glasgow. And there was one incident in particular where he attacked a man in a brutal knife assault in a petrol station, which drew the attention of big players in the underworld, and among those were the McGovern clan, and they were headed up by two notorious brothers known as Tommy and Tony. Stevenson formed a very close bond with Tony as the years progressed, and he became almost like a brother to Tony. The brotherly connection between Tony and Stevenson endured for many years, and Stevenson was sent on drug runs down to Liverpool. That became one of his routines as part of being in the gang. And during the course of that, it was mutually beneficial, because not only did they have a trustworthy lieutenant doing that particular job, but Stevenson was able to develop his own connections in Liverpool and the wider UK underworld, which would serve him well in the years to come. Like many productive relationships in the criminal underworld, it couldn't last forever, and there was an explosive fallout between Tony and Stevenson that would shape their futures in very dramatically and brutally different ways.
Glasgow in the 1980s was scarred by poverty, gangs, unemployment, crime and drugs. On these mean streets, one man reigned supreme, Arthur Thompson, dubbed the Godfather. Thompson had contacts the length and breadth of the UK, including the notorious Cray twins, and his fearsome reputation had been forged back in the 1950s. He enjoyed a dubious celebrity status in Scotland and wasn't shy in showing off the spoils from his decades in organised crime. The heir apparent to Glasgow's underworld was Paul Ferris, one of Thompson's enforcers. Ferris also enjoyed the limelight, his life story played out in the hit movie The Wee Man, but lengthy trials, blood rivalries, hitman allegations and years behind bars put paid to any kingpin ambitions. After Thompson's death in 1993, Tam the licensee McGraw emerged as the most obvious top player, though his reputation as a police informant meant he never earned the respect of a godfather figure. Instead, lesser known but ruthlessly ambitious crime mobs were operating away from the glare of the media as they vied for control of Glasgow's lucrative drugs and protection rackets. The Daniel and Lyons crews, headed by Jamie Daniel and Eddie Lyons, were building their own mini empires in the north of the city, while engaged in tit-for-tat street shootings and stabbings. Jamie Iceman Stevenson cut his teeth in Scotland's underworld as an enforcer for the notorious McGovern clan. He rose through the ranks as the mob grew in power in the 1990s to become one of Glasgow's most feared drug-dealing operations. His status seemed set in stone after he was best man at the wedding of kingpin pal Tony McGovern in July 1992. McGovern then returned the favour in 1998 when Stevenson married Caroline Adam, the mother of long-term sidekick Jerry Carbon. But Stevenson became a marked man after a fallout, and the McGoverns enlisted Robert Birdman O'Hara to have him rubbed out, but that plan backfired when the two joined forces. Then Tony McGovern was shot by a gunman on September the 16th, 2000. He was wearing a bulletproof vest when he was shot dead in his car outside this pub. No one has ever been found for the murder. One former journalist wrote a book about Jamie Stevenson called The Rise and Fall of a Crime Lord. Russell Findlay is now leader of the Scottish Conservative Party.
So as a journalist in the late 1990s, we were reporting extensively on major organised crime groups in Scotland who up until then had not received any form of attention. This included a family gang called the McGoverns, who were based in North Glasgow and Springburn, and Stevenson was connected to them very closely. He had a spectacular fallout with his friends in the McGovern family, the brothers, and that resulted in a series of tit-for-tat violence between them, resulting in a failed attempt to shoot Jamie Stevenson. And then not long thereafter, Tony McGovern, his former best friend, was shot dead in the street. Stevenson was very much the prime and indeed the only real suspect in that murder.
Yeah, the Tony McGovern shooting outside the Morven pub.
Remember it well.
Obviously, Jamie Stevenson, there was a lack of evidence to prosecute him. Do you believe that he was involved in that?
Well, there's no doubt that there were witnesses around the area who were terrified, and they declined to offer evidence in the normal way. Certainly the gossip around the area indicated that Stevenson was the main suspect and was a likely perpetrator of that murder, but there was an insufficient amount of evidence to take it to the court.
Russell wrote a book about Jamie Stevenson called The Rise and Fall of a Crime Lord, and recalls Iceman being sent down for money laundering in 2007, but questions why he was let off with drugs charges.
This book charts his beginnings involved in organised crime and rising up the kind of ladder, if you like, to creating what was an international drug smuggling network, which through the fantastic work of Scottish and police officers in Scotland and their counterparts across the UK, they brought that down, they smashed that network. Jamie Stevenson was imprisoned. He pled guilty at the High Court in Glasgow in 2007 to money laundering charges. This was part of a plea deal whereby the drug dealing charges were dropped. I found that questionable at the time. Nonetheless, he did get a significant prison sentence, which reflected the seriousness and scale of his operation. But as you say, the book was called The Rise and indeed The Fall. And I suppose what's happened since he's risen, quite spectacularly, and fallen again.
Following his release, it didn't take long for Stevenson to return to his old ways, and this time his trajectory to the top of Scotland's underworld was meteoric. An alliance with fellow Glasgow kingpin brothers James and Barry Gillespie was crucial in helping him develop a drug smuggling operation linking Scotland to South America. Underworld sources revealed to the Scottish Sun the crime lords developed a 50-50 power share deal as they masterminded a global drugs plot as long-standing allies. They worked side by side until 2019, when the Gillespies vanished, feared dead in Brazil, before James the Don White elevated himself to the top of their operation. But their lucrative smuggling streams would not last forever, and both White and Stevenson would soon see their globe-trotting criminal lifestyles crumble. An Underworld source gave an insight into the Gillespie-Stevenson nexus that supercharged their empires. The words are voiced by an actor to help protect their identity.
James Gillespie and Jamie Stevenson are the two equal bosses within the organisation. James White was moved to Brazil to be their representative. James and Barry Gillespie knew they were being hunted in connection with directing multiple murders, plus importing narcotics, weapons, explosives and money laundering. The brothers had no option than to disappear off the radar. The only connection White will have had with Stevenson is through James Gillespie, and you can be certain Stevenson will only have dealt with the Gillespie brothers and their close family members directly. When Stevenson stayed in Burnside, James Gillespie lived close by. They had equal partnership in every shipment arriving in the UK on the group's behalf. Stevenson has his own distribution networks. The wholesale has portion of the shipment, and the Gillespie brothers have theirs. When Stevenson was locked up, the brothers serviced his wholesale distribution network, and when the Gillespies became fugitives in 2019, Stevenson serviced their network.
By now, Stevenson's reputation and infamy in Scotland's underworld was such that he was even compared to Tony Soprano, the famous mafia boss from the hit TV show The Sopranos. Some say the media is often guilty of glamorising gangsters and their lavish lifestyles, which have been depicted in hit Hollywood films like Goodfellas and The Godfather.
As a journalist, I was very conscious of the fact it was a double-edged sword. The purpose of what we were doing was exposing these people, their activities, trying to disrupt them, trying to shine a light on this murky, dangerous, disgusting world. But some of these people, of course, inevitably quite liked that attention. And we were very careful, I was very careful about always wanting to ensure that we were not in any way contributing to glamorising criminals. I think taking The Sopranos as an example, if you look at that in the whole, most of them end up in a pretty sorry place. You know, that perhaps the message there is crime doesn't pay, but in the real world, all too often, crime does pay. Now, yes, Stevenson's going to jail for a very long time, hopefully. That said, his frontmen, his enablers, his white-collar supporters in the legal and accounting professions, you know, there's so much more that could be done, and I think that the authorities quite rightly should take great credit for bringing Jamie Stevenson to justice for a second time. But there should be so much more to be done in respect of the vast, dirty fortunes swirling about Scottish mainstream society.
A lot of people look at the sheer size of this operation, you know, cocaine coming from Ecuador, supposedly coming to a fruit market in Glasgow. A lot of people look at it and go, what's going on here? It's like, you know, it's like a TV episode of Sopranos.
Yes, well, he was described as Sopranos in previous occasion, and it certainly reflects the size of the industry that was created by this organised crime group. What strikes me today is that in the coming week, people are going to die in Scotland because of the abuse of drugs, and it's organisations such as the one led by Jamie Stevenson that brought the product into Scotland, which brought about decades of deaths and misery for many families in Scotland.
Stevenson was released in 2013 at the start of a decade of international drugs importation. Its scale emerged when he and 5 others were nicked in June 2020 over a £14 million street Valium factory in Rochester in Kent. Astonishingly, he was bailed again and again fled to Spain. Most people wouldn't have got bail for that kind of offence.
Well, it's a big question that needs to be asked, and we need to get a clear response about how that was achieved. This is an organised crime figure who has just completed a significant sentence and is in the middle of what was a huge pill factory. Why it was decided that he was fit and proper for bail is a mystery, and of course immediately he got on his toes to Europe and disappeared.
For a guy that's operating at the pinnacle of organised crime, with the vast wealth at his disposal, and with the contacts that he has in different European countries, including the Netherlands and Spain, I found it to be incredible, high risk. Thankfully, you know, he was tracked down in Amsterdam by the police while he was out running. But this is a guy who, you know, if you give him an inch, he will take a mile.
Those at the top level of criminality, whether they're Scottish-based or not, have those networks, and Jamie Stevenson was absolutely operating at that level.
If you were a police officer, you'd see this stuff and say it was absolute gold dust.
And then when he was released again, he went straight back into that lifestyle, and he was a globe-trotting gangster.
Jamie Stevenson's criminal empire was booming in 2019, and the tentacles of his network slithering across the globe. He was living the high life in glitzy hotspots like Dubai, Spain, and even an exotic island off the coast of Abu Dhabi. It seemed like he was king of the underworld as he raked in millions from his criminal rackets.
We all know that Jamie Stevenson, throughout his criminal career, has had a taste for the high life, like many gangsters. In his previous case, he had used a lot of his money, his dirty cash, to buy expensive watches like Rolex watches and other expensive goods as a way to launder his money. And obviously after his previous conviction, then when he was released again, he went straight back into that lifestyle. He had a globe-trotting lifestyle and he enjoyed time in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, where he spent time in a luxury island known as Nurai Island, which is popular with people with bags of cash basically. And he also had connections in South America and close to the biggest cocaine producing countries in the world. So he spent his money lavishly, and this was very much part of his motivation.
This underworld source, whose identity we are protecting, gave an insight into the high life that Jamie Stevenson was living. The words are voiced by an actor to help protect their identity.
The likes of James White and Jamie Stevenson are driven by raw selfishness and pure greed. It's in the DNA of drug traffickers to lust after social status and material wealth. Stevenson has always had a liking for designer gear, luxury holidays, and is well known he loves his Rolex watches. White was also raking in millions to feed his taste for the lavish lifestyle, well out of reach of most ordinary Scots. And we know from their actions they'll go to the most extreme lengths to protect their millions, including the easy use of violence and intimidation. Stevenson had ordered arson attacks on rivals and even ordered a firebomb attack on his former home after it was seized by prosecutors in an effort to claw back some of his dirty cash. In the end, it's all about raking in money, and no amount seems to be enough. It was mentioned in court that Stevenson knew exactly what he was doing, and the motivation for a lifetime of crime was obvious.
His lifestyle was being funded by his connections to notorious South American drug cartels, linking cocaine-producing countries in South America to Europe and the UK. Places like Brazil, Peru, Colombia and Ecuador were increasingly attractive bolt holes to hoodlums looking to profit from the UK's seemingly insatiable appetite for white powder. Among those drawn to Brazil were Scots gangsters James the Don White and kingpin brothers James and Barry Gillespie. Rio-based journalist Harold Emmert has been reporting on crime in South America for decades and got to know perhaps the UK's best-known fugitive gangster, Ronnie Biggs, when he was on the run in Brazil.
Visited Ronnie Biggs's house, but Biggs was before the time of the computer. That's how he got in. If there was a computerized time as we have now, he would have got in. But when he was here, he was living the life, we say in American, the life of Riley, but he even gave a lecture at the police academy on robberies. He even did commercials on running shoes. He says, when you're on the run, as I am, you need the best running shoes. So he attracted a certain, with his sense of humor.
More recently, Harold has worked with his Scottish Sun and now reporting of the extradition of Scots hood James the Don White, who was arrested in the coastal city of Fortaleza, where he had been living a playboy lifestyle. White of Gartcosh was jailed in 2023 for orchestrating a cocaine importation plot after being hauled back to Scotland to face justice.
This is a place, any place in the world, money speaks, but here speaks higher. An average wage here is could be $100 to $200 a month, and these criminals arrive here with wads of money, and they just tip people off, and they buy apartments or flats, and they buy malls or girlfriends, and take them out of their jobs and support them. And they're able to live a high lifestyle. In James White's case and others, or he was renting a condominium apartment, a flat right in front of the most beautiful place.
His operation was very similar to the cocaine and bananas plots run by Jamie Iceman Stevenson that saw a ton of white powder brought to the UK shores from Ecuador. But rather than using fruit shipments, White and his gang hid their haul in solar panels. It emerged at the High Court in Glasgow that White had elevated himself to the top of one of Scotland's biggest mobs, following the mysterious disappearance of former bosses James and Barry Gillespie from Rutherglen, who were last seen in Brazil in 2019, amid reports that they may have come to harm.
We have something here called the Red Command, specifically in Sao Paulo, which are laundering drug money in various parts of the world, in various parts of Brazil. We've had stories where they even used underwater divers to hide cocaine going to Scotland and or various parts of the world. And perhaps they're afraid that another people coming from abroad may be taking over their trade. So anything is possible here, but I've been in touch with the police in Fortaleza. Nobody seems to have noted the Gillespie brothers having been there, but anything is possible.
Prior to his guilty plea, Stevenson had used a defence of incrimination and blamed four men, James White, Lloyd Cross, John Goody and Stephen Jameson, for the multi-million-pound cocaine smuggling operation.
James White had previously been convicted of his involvement in another importation plot. He was bringing drugs into the country hidden in solar panels. And during his court case, it emerged that he had been a lieutenant in a gang that was run by James and Barry Gillespie. These are two Scottish criminals who haven't been seen since 2019. It's understood that they were last seen alive in Brazil, and this is where James White was arrested. He was arrested in Brazil by Brazilian police and then extradited back to Scotland to face justice. But during his court case, we heard that James White had told associates back in Scotland that with James and Barry Gillespie being missing, he was actually going to be taking over the operation. So he essentially became the leader of the Gillespie gang. And question marks still hang over the whereabouts of the Gillespie brothers. Police Scotland have, we understand, fear that they may have come to harm, may even have been murdered, and that relatives of the Gillespies have been given that information by Police Scotland. But through our own investigations and speaking to authorities in Brazil, that information isn't something that's known to law enforcement in Brazil, which creates the possibility that the Gillespies aren't dead and that they could still be alive. But until their bodies are found, or until they're found alive, it just creates this mystery.
We are now on the cusp of a rapid acceleration of the spread of coronavirus. We could see a doubling of cases every few days.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others and to stop all unnecessary travel. We need people to start working from home where they possibly can.
Everything was going right for Jamie Stevenson in early 2020 as he started planning his most audacious plot to date. But things were about to change as the COVID pandemic was about to hit and throw the world into chaos. A month before the first lockdown in March that year, Stevenson had sealed the deal that would see him ship 1 tonne of cocaine from Ecuador to the UK. He met with David Bilsland to discuss the plan that would involve using a Glasgow fruit market business as a front for his scheme. But unbeknown to Bilsland and Stevenson, they were being watched.
Well, the police found out that Stevenson was involved unexpectedly, because they had been given information in 2019 that a man called David Bilsland, who had no previous convictions, was worth a closer look. So they started to investigate his fruit business in Glasgow, and that led them to discover that he was travelling to Alicante in Spain. This was in February 2020, so they contacted their counterparts in Spain and asked them if they could follow David Bilsland and surveil him. It was unusual because he was only going for 1 day, and they discovered that he had no luggage, so it was a strange and suspicious activity. So the Spanish police followed Bilsland to a hotel in Alicante where he met a man for coffee. Obviously, the Spanish police had no idea who this guy was, but they took pictures of the pair together and sent those pictures back to Scotland. And within seconds of receiving that picture, the police knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they were astonished to see Jamie Stevenson sitting at a table with David Bilsland. At that point, the police had no idea of the scale of the criminality that David Bilsland had got involved in. It's possible that Bilsland himself never really fully appreciated what he was getting involved in at that time. It came out in court that Bilsland claimed the moment he realised that who he was dealing with, that he didn't have the courage to back out. And I guess you could have some sympathy with that, knowing Stevenson's reputation. But Bilsland perhaps was a little bit naive, but once he stepped over the line, he couldn't step back.
Stevenson was arrested for his part in trying to flood the streets with Valium, along with stepson Jerry Carbon and sidekick Paul Bowles. They set up a pill factory in Kent, which churned out 250,000 tablets an hour and was worth £14 million.
Intel led officers here to the Sherbrooke Hotel in Glasgow's south side, where Stevenson was having a meeting with some associates at a picnic table. When he clocked police officers heading towards him, he feared the worst and ran for his life. As Stevenson fled the mystery men who he thought were trying to kill him, he rolled down an embankment and ended up in a crumpled heap. But as the officers approached him and made their identities known, the criminal kingpin let out a sigh of relief. During the panic, Stevenson left his Encrochat mobile phone handset on a picnic table, and that later led investigators to show beyond all doubt that Stevenson was calling the shots using the Encrochat handles Elusive Ale and Big Tasty, tying him to a global drugs conspiracy.
Astonishingly, Stevenson was freed by English authorities and went on the run to Spain and falls off the radar. The takedown of the encrypted Encrochat network used by criminals was key to the demise of Jamie Iceman Stevenson's empire, as well as hundreds of other hoodlums operating in Scotland, the UK and Europe. The 2020 bust by Dutch and French forces saw millions of incriminating messages swept up and passed on to crime fighters, including Britain's National Crime Agency, who launched what became known as Operation Venetic.
Encrochat was a super secure smartphone system. It was based on Android handsets. Almost impossible for people to crack, either by going into the phone or by trying to eavesdrop. It costs you £1,500 to buy the handset, and that only bought you 6 months worth of subscription. If you wanted another 6 months, another £800. So not intended for the ordinary member of the public who wanted a little bit of security. The break into Encrochat was carried out by a Dutch and French team. French were in operational control. Very ingenious. Instead of trying to get into the phones directly, which has proved more or less impossible, what they did was they looked at the server, the computer that was actually running everything. They got a copy of that. They bought themselves some covert phones, worked out how everything was supposed to operate. And what they then said was, well, these phones seem to have the same sort of facility for updating and changing things that regular phones do. Let us craft an update which actually weakens the encryption so that we can download the messages and decrypt them. They've never provided any of the detail of how they've done it, but that's how it was broken. And then having broken it, the French set up a big operation, collected a lot of information from all over the world, and they then passed the results out to law enforcement people all over the world, including the National Crime Agency here in the United Kingdom. See, if you were a police officer, you'd see this stuff and say it was absolute gold dust, because once you're sort of broken a little bit into the slang, drug dealers have their own sort of slang as well. It's pretty easy to break, but you could see exactly what was happening, and you could see photographs, and a number of instances people were showing photographs of themselves, showing them with packages of cocaine, with large quantities of money, and For a large number of investigations, not all of them, but for a large number of them, police had a relatively easy route to conviction.
And it was incriminating messages like these between Jamie Stevenson and Lloyd Cross which eventually led to their downfall. A fruit market in a Glasgow industrial estate, miles away from the sunshine and sand of Brazil. But it was here that £100 million worth of cocaine was due to be delivered and shipped across the country. But Stevenson arranged for 17 legitimate shipments of bananas to be sent as dummy runs, in case the police were onto him. However, the last shipment that was sent included a ton of cocaine hidden among boxes of bananas. And the police were watching him, and the huge drug haul was intercepted in Dover in September 2020 by the National Crime Agency, while the fruit market in Glasgow was being raided by police. This is where David Bilsland confided in a pal that he was facing a long time in jail for his part in Jamie Stevenson's cocaine banana smuggling plot. He set up a firm called Glasgow Fruit Markets Limited. One base was here, the other was based in Kennedy Street, about a mile away. But after cops raided the buildings, a refrigeration engineer who had fitted banana ripening equipment for Bilsland was concerned for his pal. Andrew Wilson gave evidence at the High Court in Glasgow and told jurors Bilsland looked like a ghost when he asked him about the raid in June 2020. He recalled visiting Bilsland a day or two later and said in his police statement, "David was looking terrible. He looked as if he had seen a ghost and was a broken man. He was normally upbeat and bubbly. I had never seen him like that. He was almost about to start crying. He told me he had done something stupid and put his hands up to it and was going to jail for a long time and that police arrested him. I can't remember exactly what it was to do with, but drugs were mentioned." In January 2022, the National Crime Agency included Stevenson as part of the 12 most wanted UK criminals across Europe. And just 2 weeks later, following an operation by the NCA, Police Scotland and the Dutch National Police, Stevenson was arrested while jogging in a street in Holland and extradited back to Scotland.
Yeah, so the police got information telling them that Stevenson was in Holland, and they, with the Dutch police, arrested him. And by chance, he had been spotted out jogging with another Scottish fugitive, Dean Ferguson. So the two of them would have been in for a shock that day when they were out on a fitness kick, essentially. And suddenly they found themselves surrounded by Dutch police and quickly taken into custody, and both were then eventually shipped back to Scotland to face justice.
Jamie Stevenson's latest trial began on August the 7th this year at the High Court in Glasgow and was expected to last around 5 weeks before a series of dramatic twists cut the process short. The first came when co-accused Lloyd Cross admitted his involvement in the plot to shipping a massive haul of cocaine from Ecuador to a fruit market in Glasgow.
But something unexpected happened on that day, where one of the accused, Lloyd Cross, changed his plea from not guilty to charge 4 on the indictment. And that was quite an astonishing turn of events that took most of us by surprise. There was one other striking detail in court after Cross pled guilty. Stevenson had stepped forward before the case called to chat to his legal team. It's impossible to know what that conversation was about, but as he turned round and walked back into the dock, he locked eyes with Cross for what seemed like a considerable length of time, a slightly uneasy moment in the courtroom. But obviously we can only speculate as to what that meant, but the question that obviously jumped out was, had Cross taken Stevenson by surprise when he entered that guilty plea? Or was Stevenson giving Cross his approval? Maybe it was part of a defence strategy. We'll never really know, but from that point onward, it meant that Stevenson had to reconsider his situation, as did the other 5 men who were still in the dock.
But after 3 days of evidence, 2 more held their hands up. Jerry Carbon and Ryan McPhee pleaded guilty to running a street Valium factory as part of Stevenson's operation. Gary McIntyre walked free when he was cleared of all charges. It was a decisive moment that ended the following day when Scotland's #1 hood Stevenson finally changed his plea to guilty, along with Paul Bowes and fruit merchant David Bilsland.
Well, when the indictment first became available, we noted the name David Bilsland, and he wasn't someone who was a known criminal. Essentially, he had no previous convictions. But what we do know about David Bilsland is that he was a respected businessman for decades in Glasgow, involved in the fruit and veg business, and had many connections throughout the business community in Glasgow. So it was very strange to see a man like him sitting in the dock alongside known criminals like Jamie Stevenson and Jerry Carbon. When Bilsland was walking into court, he looked more like a lawyer, or he looked like a businessman. You wouldn't give him a second look, because you would assume that he was maybe representing someone rather than being represented himself. But in the end, he pled guilty too to being a co-conspirator in this case. He basically set up the businesses, the fake businesses, that allowed them to bring in these huge quantities of bananas that had the cocaine hidden within. It's astonishing, it really is. It's a ton of cocaine. It's hard just for ordinary people to even think what that would involve, but clearly this is a massive operation that involved Scottish gangsters, criminals having connections around the globe with some of the biggest drug cartels in the world, places like Colombia, Ecuador, who are the biggest producers of cocaine on the planet. And yet there are guys here in Glasgow who've got the connections to be able to bring that amount of narcotics into the country. It really is staggering.
So one aspect of this conviction is the recovery of almost a tonne of cocaine that was exported from Ecuador. Now, the cost of that alone and the logistics and support into that were not insignificant. But he would have to know people in South America. He would have to know people across ports of exit, ports of entry, and understand the regulatory systems in those corresponding countries. I think it shows that he was operating at the highest levels and would have been undeterred had law enforcement not brought an end to that criminal venture.
So whilst he's Scottish based, obviously the impacts have been, as you'll see from this case, across the UK, into Europe, and actually internationally as well, South America. So yes, those at the top level of criminality, whether they're Scottish based or not, have those networks. And Jamie Stevenson was absolutely operating at that level.
An underworld source revealed that as members of the gang started to plead guilty, Stevenson could see he no longer had control over them, and that led to clashes between Stevenson and stepson Jerry Carbon. The words are voiced by an actor to help protect their identity.
Jamie Stevenson isn't a man you go against without expecting severe retribution. The feeling was he wanted his co-accused to stick out the trial to keep his own options open, but once he started dropping one by one, the writing was on the wall and even he knew it. It's clear that his relationship with his firm, even his own stepson Carbon, is fractured. That could yet end up in more violence. Just because Stevenson is in jail shouldn't make anyone think he doesn't still hold a huge amount of power and influence.